The iron gates of the Stirling Manor didn't just creak. They groaned with the weight of a century's worth of rust and resentment. Elias Thorne, a man whose life was measured in archival ink and the dust of forgotten attics, stood before the skeletal remains of the house. Lowndes County was a place where the humidity felt like a wet wool blanket, and the air tasted of stagnant swamp water and blooming. Jasmine, a sweet mask for the rot beneath. Elias was the last of the Stirling line, though his mother had changed their name and fled the Georgia heat decades ago. He had returned not for an inheritance of gold, but for the inheritance of truth. The manor was a jagged silhouette against the bruised purple of the twilight sky, its white paint peeling like dead skin. Local legend said the house was hungry, that it had swallowed the morality of the men who built it, and now waited for the last of their blood to return. Stepping onto the porch, the wood shrieked under his boots. The interior smelled of wet plaster, rodent droppings, and a strange metallic tongue that Elias couldn't quite place. He made his way to the library, a room that had once been the intellectual nerve center of the plantation. Now the mahogany shelves were bowed and empty, save for the ghosts of books long ago. Claimed by Silverfish and Damp Dot, he had a map, a hand-drawn sketch found in his grandmother's cedar chest. It led him to the far corner of the library, beneath an oversized window draped in tattered velvet. Elias knelt, his knees cracking in the silence. He tapped the floorboards. Hollow dot with a crowbar and a grunt of exertion, he pried the wood upward. The scream of the nails was deafening. Beneath the floor lay a shallow cavity lined with lead, and there, wrapped in a moth-eaten silk shroud, sat the book. It was bound in leather so deeply stained it looked like dried scabs. The Crimson Ledger. As Elias touched the cover, a jolt of static electricity sparked against his fingertip, a sharp needle of pain that made him gasp. He pulled the book into the light of his flashlight. The leather was supple, eerily so, feeling almost like human flesh that had been tanned and cured. There was no title on the spine, only a series of deep, vertical gashes. Elias sat on the floor, the dust motes dancing in his beam of light like tiny, panicked spirits. He opened the first page. The handwriting was exquisite, spidery, elegant, and chillingly precise. It belonged to Eleanor Stirling. August 14th, 1847. Purchased 12 bushels of corn, 4 sets of iron shackles, tempered, 2 gallons of whale oil. Note: the girl, Sarah, shows signs of resilience. Her bone structure is ideal. I have instructed Julian to begin the visitation schedule this evening. We must ensure the stock is of the highest caliber if the Stirling name is to endure the coming droughts. Elias felt a cold sweat prickle his hairline. He turned the page, his breath coming in shallow hitches. The ledger was a ledger in the truest, most horrific sense. It treated human lives as inventory, but with a twist that defied the standard cruelty of the era. November 2nd, 1847. Julian complains of the task. He lacks his father's stomach. I reminded him that his seed is not his own. It belongs to this soil. If he does not perform, I shall have Thomas take his place. The blood must remain concentrated. The experiment requires a closed loop. The entries became a nauseating rhythm of the mundane and the monstrous. One line would discuss the price of cotton per pound, and the very next would detail the successful union between Eleanor's own son and an enslaved woman, followed by a list of physical traits she hoped to cultivate in the resulting child. Elias flipped further, his eyes scanning dates and figures. By 1852, the tone of the ledger shifted. The entries were no longer just about profit or lineage. They began to sound like the ravings of a cultist. April 12, 1852. The 3rd child was born today. It does not cry. Its eyes are the color of a bruised plum, much like my own. Julian is terrified, the weakling. He says the child watches him, even when he leaves the room. I told him he should be proud. We are building something that can never be broken by man or law. We are weaving the sterling soul into the very marrow of the help. A floorboard creaked behind him. Elias spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The library was empty, yet the air felt crowded. The temperature in the room had plummeted. He looked back at the ledger. On the page he had just been reading, a new stain was blooming afresh. Wet drop of crimson that hadn't been there a second ago. He touched the drop. It was warm. Got the house wasn't just hungry. It was recording. The crimson ledger wasn't a book of the past. It was a living document. As Elias stared at the red stain, he realized with a jolt of pure, visceral terror that the handwriting at the bottom of the page was changing. It was no longer Eleanor's spidery script. It was a jagged, desperate scrawl that looked suspiciously like his own. He has returned. The ink seemed to whisper as it dried. The circle begins to close. Elias tried to drop the book, but his fingers felt fused to the leather. The shadows in the corners of the library began to stretch, crawling toward him like spilled ink. He realized then that the selective lineage Eleanor had written about wasn't just a plan for her slaves. It was a trap for her descendants. He was the caliper she had been waiting for. He was the final entry dot to understand the rot in the floorboards. One had to understand the woman who planted the seeds. In 1852, Eleanor Sterling did not merely walk through the halls of Sterling Manor. She haunted them while she was still breathing. She was a woman carved from flint and cold iron, wrapped in the stiff black silk of perpetual widowhood. Since the passing of her husband Silas, she had become the undisputed sovereign of Lowndes County, a matriarch who viewed her vast acreage not as a farm, but as a laboratory of human flesh. The sun in Georgia was a cruel god that summer, baking the earth until it cracked like parched skin. But inside the manor, the air remained unnaturally chilled. Eleanor sat in her high-backed velvet chair, her spine never touching the embroidery. Her face was a mask of aristocratic severity-high cheekbones, skin the color of aged parchment, and eyes that were a startling, bruised violet. They were eyes that seemed to see through walls, through skin, and into the very secret shallowness of the men who served her. She watched from the veranda as her three sons Julian, Thomas, and Silas Jr. crossed the yard. They were tall, handsome men, the pride of the county, but in her presence they shrank. They were not sons to her. They were biological assets. She had spent their childhoods pruning their spirits like she pruned her rose bushes, cutting away empathy and weakness until only the sterling ego remained. "Julian," she called out, her voice like the snap of a dry twig. The eldest son stopped mid-stride, his shoulders tensing. He ascended the stairs, his hat in his hand, refusing to meet those violet eyes. "Yes, Mother?" "The girl, Sarah, in the infirmary," Eleanor said, her voice devoid of any maternal warmth. "She has recovered from the fever. The cycle is favorable. You will go to her tonight." Julian's knuckles whitened as he gripped the brim of his hat. "Mother, the men in town, they are starting to talk. They see the children in the quarters. They see the eyes. They see the sterling chin on faces that shouldn't have them. It's a scandal that will bury us." Eleanor rose, her silk skirts hissing against the floorboards like a nest of disturbed vipers. She stepped close to him, so close he could smell the cloying scent of dried lavender and the faint, metallic odor of the tonic she drank for her nerves. "Let them talk," she whispered, her voice a low, rhythmic chant. "The townspeople are sheep, grazing on the surface of the world. We are the wolves who own the soil beneath them. Do you think the pharaohs cared for the gossip of the mud-flyers? We are perfecting a lineage, Julian, a workforce that is bound to us not just by chains of iron, but by the very blood that beats in their hearts. A slave who carries your own blood is a slave who can never truly rebel, for to strike at us would be to strike at themselves. She reached out, her long, thin fingers tracing the line of his jaw. Her touch was ice cold. You are merely the vessel, Julian. Do not mistake your fleeting morality for importance. You will do as the ledger commands. As Julian slunk away, defeated, the shadow of Eleanor seemed to detach itself from her feet, stretching long and distorted across the porch. The enslaved people in the fields felt it. They called her the Spider. They saw how she spent her nights in the library, hunched over the crimson ledger, scratching out her calculations of birth, death, and selective refinement. The horror of Eleanor Sterling wasn't just her cruelty. It was her clinical detachment. To her, the human soul was a variable to be bred out, leaving only the strength of the beast and the loyalty of the hound. She had convinced herself that through this grotesque alchemy of incest and exploitation, she was creating a new world dynasty that would outlast the inevitable fall of the South. She stood at the railing, looking toward the slave quarters, a row of cabins huddled in the shadow of the great oaks. Among the children playing in the dirt, there were those who didn't play. They sat in the shade, their violet eyes her eyes, staring back at the big house with a terrifying, vacant intelligence. They were the hollow-eyed ones, the fruit of her labor. Eleanor smiled, a thin, bloodless line. She felt a deep, thrumming connection to the land. She believed she had made a pact with the Lowndes County soil, that as long as she fed it the blood of her own kin, the Sterling name would never die. She didn't notice the way the kudzu vines seemed to reach for the house with grasping, finger-like tendrils. She didn't notice that the birds had stopped singing on the Sterling estate. The only sound was the scratching of her pen in the library, a sound that echoed the grinding of teeth, that the matriarch's shadow wasn't just a lack of light. It was a living infection. It seeped into the water, into the grain, and into the minds of her sons. By the end of 1852, the manor was no longer a home. It was an altar, and Eleanor Sterling was the high priestess of a religion written in the crimson ledger dot by the autumn of Vather, 1852. The atmosphere within Sterling Manor had reached a fever pitch of quiet, suffocating dread. The air in the library hung heavy with the scent of copper and old parchment. It was here that the ritual of the bloodline was codified not as a single event, but as a systematic nightly desecration of the natural order. Eleanor had moved beyond mere management. She had become an architect of the flesh. She sat at her desk, the crimson ledger open before her. The ink she used now seemed darker, thicker, as if it were clogging the nib of her quill. She was no longer just recording births. She was drafting the blueprints for the perfected servant. The ritual began with the selection. Every Friday evening, as the sun dipped below the cypress trees and the bullfrogs began their rhythmic, mournful chanting, Eleanor would summon her sons. They would stand in a row, Julian, the eldest and most broken. Thomas, the middle son who had turned to whiskey to drown the visions. And young Silas Jr., who was beginning to develop the same cold, violet glint in his eyes as his mother. "The soil is hungry," Eleanor would whisper, her voice barely audible over the scratching of the cicadas outside. "And the blood must be concentrated to sat it." She would present them with a name from the ledger. These were not random choices. She had mapped out the traits of every woman in the quarters, their stamina, their obedience, the thickness of their skin, the strength of their teeth. She was cross-referencing these physical attributes with the Sterling temperament, seeking to create a creature that possessed the Sterling intellect, but lacked the Sterling will. The sons were then sent out into the night. It was a walk of shame that had become a walk of habit. The enslaved community knew when the bloodline walk was happening. A heavy, unnatural silence would fall over the cabins. No songs were sung. No fires were lit. They waited in the dark, like prey, waiting for the predator's shadow to pass. The horror of these unions was compounded by the supernatural aura that had begun to permeate the estate. It was said that during these nights, the very shadows of the Sterling sons would detach and enter the cabins before the men did. Sarah, the woman Julian had been forced to visit, whispered to the others that when Julian touched her, his skin felt like cold marble, and she could hear his mother's voice whispering in his ear, directing his movements, orating the ledger's commands through his mouth. Eleanor didn't stay in the house during these hours. She would walk the perimeter of the quarters, a tall black specter carrying a lantern shielded by red glass. She wasn't guarding against escape. She was witnessing. She believed that her presence, the presence of the matriarch, was the catalyst needed to bind the soul of the unborn child to the land. One night, Thomas, fueled by a bottle of bourbon and a sudden, jagged spark of rebellion, refused. "I won't do it, Mother. Not again. The girl, Mary, she's barely 20. She looks at me like I'm a demon. I can't see my own face in the mirror anymore without seeing a monster." Eleanor didn't scream. She didn't strike him. She simply opened the crimson ledger to a page Thomas had never seen. It was a list of names, his names. Not just his birth, but a detailed account of his every sin, his every weakness, and a horrifying prediction of his death. "You are already written, Thomas," she said, her voice smooth as oil. "You cannot walk off the page. If you refuse to plant the seed, I will ensure you become the fertilizer. The land does not care how it receives the Sterling blood, only that it is fed." That night, Thomas walked to the quarters with tears streaming down his face, his legs moving as if pulled by invisible wires. He realized then that they were all slaves to the ledger, the sons as much as the workers. The ritual extended to the infants born of these forced unions. Within an hour of their birth, Eleanor would have them brought to the library. She would prick the child's heel with a silver needle and let a single drop of blood fall onto the ledger's page. If the blood stayed bright red, the child was kept in the quarters. If the blood turned black upon touching the paper, a phenomenon that defied every law of science, child was taken to the cellar of shadows beneath the manor. These were the anomalies. They were the children, who were too much like her. They were born with full sets of teeth or eyes that never closed. They were the physical manifestations of the Sterling rot, and Eleanor kept them like a dark secret, feeding them scraps and waiting for the day they would be ripe for her final plan. By the end of this chapter, the reader should feel the crushing weight of this cycle. The manor had become a factory of human misery, where the ritual of the bloodline was the conveyor belt. The sons were losing their humanity. The enslaved were being subjected to a horror beyond mere labor. And at the center of it all sat Eleanor, her violet eyes reflecting the red light of her lantern, her pen never ceasing its scratching. The chapter ends with a chilling observation from the ledger. The harvest is nearing. The sons are hollowed out, ready to be filled with the land's true purpose. The blood is thick. The blood is one. By the spring of 1853, the fruits of Eleanor's selective lineage had begun to ripen. But the harvest was far from the strong, obedient workforce she had promised in her earlier entries. The children born of the Sterling sons were now walking, and there was a terrifying wrongness to their gait. They did not play, they did not cry, and they did not speak in the tongues of men. They were known in hushed whispers across Lowndes County as the hollow-eyed ones, while the other children in the slave quarters grew with the lean, natural hunger of youth. These children seemed to absorb the light around them. Their skin was a grayish pallor, stretched tight over bones that seemed to have too many joints. But it was their eyes, a sterling violet, deep and bruised, that froze the blood of anyone who dared look too long. Eleanor spent her days walking through the rows of the unnatural harvest. She would carry a small silver bell, and at its ring, the children would stop in unison, turning their heads with a synchronized, mechanical precision. March 14th, 1853. The yield is exceptional. The latest batch shows a remarkable lack of the willful trait. They move as a single organism. I observed them today in the shade of the weeping willow. They sat for 6 hours without a single movement. Their heartbeat is slow, matching the pulse of the swamp. We are no longer breeding laborers. We are breeding a permanent extension of this sterling estate. Asterisk. The horror of the harvest was most visible in the infirmary. Sarah, the woman who had been the first victim of Julian's forced visits, watched her own child with a mixture of maternal instinct and soul-deep terror. The boy, whom she refused to name, grew at an impossible rate. Within months, he had the proportions of a 5-year-old, but his mind seemed to be connected to something far older. He would sit by the window, his lips moving in silent conversation with the wind that rattled the shutters of the big house. As the children grew, the land itself began to change. The cotton crops, usually white and fluffy, began to sprout streaks of rusty red, as if the plants were drinking from a vein beneath the soil. The water in the wells tasted of copper. The livestock grew agitated. Horses would throw their riders if they approached the hollow-eyed ones, sensing an apex predator in the bodies of toddlers. The sons, meanwhile, were decaying. Julian had taken to wandering the woods at night, his eyes bloodshot and his clothes tattered. He claimed he could hear the children's thoughts, a buzzing, collective hum that sounded like 1,000 locusts. "They aren't ours, Mother," he screamed at Eleanor during a dinner that sat untouched on the mahogany table. "They belong to the dirt. They are just using our faces to walk on the surface." Eleanor merely sipped her dark tonic and turned a page in the crimson ledger. "They are the only immortality you will ever achieve, Julian. Be grateful." The harvest wasn't just physical. It was a harvest of the house's sanity. The ledger began to record vibrations and atmospheric alignments. Eleanor became obsessed with the cellar, with the anomalies, the children whose blood had turned black or kept. She called it her seed bank. No one was allowed down there. But the sounds that drifted up through the floorboards, the scratching, the wet slithering, and the low, harmonic moaning made the house staff quit in the middle of the night, fleeing into the swamps rather than staying another hour in Sterling Manor. One evening, a local doctor was summoned to examine a child who had fallen from a loft. When he peeled back the child's eyelids, he didn't find a pupil. He found a swirling vortex of violet mist. He left his medical bag and rode his horse until it collapsed from exhaustion. Never returning to Lowndes County. The ledger's entry for that night was brief. The veil is thinning. The harvest is nearly ready for the winnowing. The blood is the key, and the key is turning in the lock. The chapter ends with the protagonist in the present day. Elias, looking at a grainy 19th century photograph he found tucked into the back of the ledger. It shows a group of children standing in front of the manor. Though the photo is blurred, the eyes of the children are white-hot pinpricks of light that seem to burn through the very paper, staring directly at Elias across a century of silence. While the big house was a fortress of cold stone and clinical cruelty, the slave quarters were a landscape of living terror. In the shadows of the cabins, where the white family's gaze rarely lingered, a different kind of history was being recorded, not in ink, but in the frantic, whispered oral traditions of a people who realized they were being consumed by something ancient and hungry. The quarters were no longer just a place of rest for the weary. They had become a nursery for the damned. The air there felt thicker, buzzing with a static charge that made the hair on one's arms stand up. The enslaved people began to practice the shielding, a series of rituals involving salt across thresholds and charms made of twisted iron to keep the hollow-eyed ones from entering their dreams. Sarah, once the most vibrant woman on the plantation, had become the silent sentinel of the quarters. Since the birth of the child she refused to name, she had not slept a full night. She sat on her porch, her eyes fixed on the big house, watching the red glow of Eleanor's lantern move from window to window like a wandering star. "It ain't just slavery no more," she whispered to the elders gathered around a small, hidden fire. "Slavery is about work. This is about eating. She's feeding us to her sons, and she's feeding her sons to the ground. Can't you feel it? The dirt under our feet is getting heavy. It's drinking the wrong things." The whispers grew into a cohesive, terrifying theory. The elders, some of whom remembered the old stories from across the sea, spoke of the bloodroot. They believed Eleanor Sterling had found a way to tether the souls of the living to the physical property of the estate. By forcing her sons to father children with the enslaved, she was creating a biological anchor that would prevent the Sterling essence from ever leaving. Lowndes County. The horror intensified when the children began to exhibit the hum. Late at night, the hollow-eyed ones would stand at the edge of the woods, their voices joining in a low-frequency vibration that rattled the glass in the cabin windows. It wasn't a song. It was a call. And from the dark, damp cellar of the big house, something would always answer back. The enslaved people noticed that the anomalies kept in the cellar were being used as a sort of psychic battery. Whenever a new child was born, the atmosphere in the quarters would become so oppressive that it was difficult to breathe. The birds stayed away from the trees, and the dogs, usually vocal and territorial, would hide under the cabins, whimpering and clawing at their own ears until they bled. "She's writing us out of the world," Sarah warned. "The ledger. It's a cage. Every name she puts in that book, she owns a piece of their spirit. And the ones with the violet eyes? They don't have spirits at all. They're just windows for her to look through." The most chilling whisper, however, concerned the midnight tithe. It was said that Eleanor didn't just record the births. She was performing a slow, methodical sacrifice. The physical health of the enslaved people was being siphoned off to maintain her unnatural longevity and her son's forced vitality. Men who were young and strong in the morning would wake up gray-haired and brittle, while Eleanor's skin seemed to grow smoother, her violet eyes more luminous. The chapter reaches a breaking point when Sarah discovers a small, carved wooden figure under her child's bedding. It wasn't a toy. It was a crude likeness of Julian Sterling, but its chest was hollowed out, filled with Sarah's own hair and a scrap of paper with a single word, written in Eleanor's spidery hand. Vessel. The quarters were no longer a refuge. They were a pantry. The realization spread through the community like a cold sweat. They weren't just being used for labor. They were being bred as shells for the Sterling bloodline to inhabit when their own bodies failed. The whispers turned from fear to a desperate, jagged resolve. If they were to be consumed, they would make sure the Sterling line choked on the meal. The chapter ends with Sarah looking at the hollow-eyed boy sitting at her feet. He turns his head 180 degrees, his violet eyes locking onto hers, and for the first time, he speaks. It isn't a child's voice. It is the layered, echoing voice of every Sterling who has ever died. The ledger is hungry, Mother Sarah, and it is almost time for the feast. In the present day, Elias sat in the oppressive silence of the library, the crimson ledger heavy across his lap. The flashlight beam flickered, struggling against the gloom that seemed to leak from the book's very seams. As he turned the pages toward the middle of the volume, the elegant, spidery script of Eleanor Sterling began to disintegrate. It was no longer English. It was a cacophony of symbols, geometric patterns, and what looked like anatomical sketches of the human nervous system intertwined with the root structures of cypress trees. Elias, a man trained in the logic of history, felt his mind begin to fray at the edges. He realized that the ledger wasn't just a record of crimes. It was a manual. The secret language was a blend of high-level mathematics, occult sigils, and a terrifying understanding of blood resonance. As he stared at the symbols, they began to swim. He realized that the ink was indeed alive. It didn't just sit on top of the parchment. It pulsed. When he ran his fingers over the diagrams, he didn't feel paper. He felt a faint, rhythmic thrumming. Like the heartbeat of a bird trapped in a box dot, the language revealed the true nature of the Sterling breeding program. It wasn't about wealth or even white supremacy in the traditional sense. It was about transcendence. Eleanor had discovered or perhaps bargained for the knowledge that human consciousness could be tethered to a specific geographic location if the blood was folded back on itself enough times. June 19, 1853. Translated fragment. The geometry is nearly complete. By intersecting the sterling marrow with the cerulean, we have created a psychic dampener. The children do not have souls because their souls are currently being held in escrow by the land. I am the banker. I am the vault. Elise noticed that the margins were filled with tiny, frantic notes in a different hand, likely Julian's. She isn't writing the book anymore, one note read. The book is writing her. We are all just characters in a story the soil wants to tell. The secret language also explained the anomalies in the cellar. They weren't accidents. They were failed drafts. Every time Eleanor pricked a child's heel and the blood turned black, it meant the vessel was too weak to hold the concentrated sterling essence. The black ink in the ledger was, quite literally, the processed remains of those who didn't survive the folding. As Elias read, the library around him began to distort. The smell of copper intensified, becoming so thick he could taste it on the back of his throat. He looked down at his own hands and saw that the veins in his wrists were turning a faint, bruised violet. The ledger was communicating with his blood. Recognizing a familiar frequency, he found a page toward the end of the 1853 entries that contained a map of the manor. But it wasn't a map of the rooms. It was a map of the house's circulatory system. It showed how the floorboards, the chimneys, and the foundation were all connected to the cellar, and from the cellar out into the slave quarters. The house was a giant wooden lung, breathing in the lives of the inhabitants and exhaling the crimson language. Suddenly, the flashlight died. In the absolute darkness, the ledger began to glow with a faint, sickly bioluminescence. The symbols lifted off the page, hovering in the air like neon ghosts. Elias tried to scream, but his voice was caught in his throat, replaced by the low-frequency hum he had read about in the previous chapters. He wasn't just reading the history of Lowndes County anymore. He was being translated into it. The secret language was no longer a mystery to him. He could feel the meaning of the symbols in his bones. They spoke of the red moon and the final winnowing. The chapter ends with Elias realizing that the empty pages at the end of the ledger were not empty because the story had stopped. They were empty because they were waiting for his blood to provide the ink. The secret language required a fresh scribe every century to keep the sterling anchor from drifting. He reached into his pocket for his pocketknife. His movements slow and mechanical, his eyes reflecting the violet glow of the hovering sigils. The house whispered a single word in a language that predated man, and Elias understood. Record. The atmospheric tension. That had been building since 1847. Finally broke on the night of August 14, 1853. A rare celestial alignment had turned the moon into a swollen, copper-colored orb that hung low over the Lowndes County swamps, casting a light so red it looked as though the sky were hemorrhaging. In the big house, Eleanor Sterling knew the time for the final folding had arrived. She stood in the center of the library, the furniture pushed to the walls to reveal a massive, etched sigil on the floorboards, the same geometric pattern Elias would discover a century later. It was stained dark with the ink of the ledger. "Bring them," she commanded. Julian and Silas Jr. entered, dragging Sarah's hollow-eyed boy between them. The sons looked like walking corpses. Their skin was translucent, and their movements were jerky, as if their muscles were being pulled by invisible hooks. Behind them, the anomalies emerged from the cellar pail, featureless things that moved with a sickening liquid grace. They were the discarded drafts of the Sterling line, and tonight they were to be the witnesses. The ritual of the bloodline was no longer a secret act of procreation. It had evolved into a visceral, spine-chilling ceremony of spiritual consumption. Eleanor intended to collapse the lineage into a single point, a blood anchor, using the red moon's resonance to fuse the Sterling consciousness into the boy, making him an immortal vessel that could never leave the plantation grounds. As the moon reached its zenith, the air in the room began to hum with a frequency that shattered the glass in the library's bookcases. Eleanor began to chant in the secret language, her voice layering upon itself until it sounded like a choir of the damned. Outside, the plantation was in chaos. The enslaved people had gathered at the edge of the woods, led by Sarah. They didn't have guns or knives. They had the shielding charms and the collective power of their ancestors. They could feel the land screaming under the weight of Eleanor's blasphemy. The very kudzu vines seemed to writhe in the red moonlight, reaching toward the manor as if to pull it into the earth. Inside the circle, the boy stood perfectly still. His violet eyes began to glow with a terrifying, white-hot intensity. As Eleanor chanted, the shadows of the three sons began to stretch toward the boy, detaching from their feet and flowing across the floor like spilled oil. Julian let out a strangled cry as he felt his very identity being siphoned away, his memories and his will being poured into the child. "It is the harvest!" Eleanor shrieked, her mask of composure finally breaking into a manic, predatory grin. The blood returned to the root. But something went wrong. The blood that Eleanor had spent years refining had a memory of its own. It carried the pain of the women she had broken, and the silent rage of the children she had discarded. As the spirits of the sons merged into the boy, the anomalies from the cellar began to scream, not in pain, but in recognition. They surged forward, breaking the circle. The red moonlight through the window caught the crimson ledger, which lay open on the altar. The book began to bleed in earnest, the liquid pouring off the desk and pooling on the floor. The sigil Eleanor had drawn didn't protect her. It became a trap. The land she had tried to bind began to reject the folded blood. The house groaned, a sound of wood and stone being twisted by a giant hand. A fissure opened in the library floor, and the metallic smell of the cellar wafted up, thick and suffocating. Sarah, watching from the yard, saw the red moon reflect in the windows of the manor, making the entire building look as if it were filled with fire. "The ground is spitting them out," Sarah whispered, clutching her charms. In the final moments of the ritual, the hollow-eyed boy looked at Eleanor. He didn't see her as a mother or a queen. He saw her as the source of the rot. He opened his mouth, and instead of a scream, a torrent of black, ink-like smoke poured out, engulfing the matriarch. The sons collapsed, their bodies hollowed out, their souls lost in the void between the ledger and the boy. The night of the red moon ended not with a new dynasty, but with a psychic explosion that scarred the very soil of Lowndes County. The manor stood, but it was no longer a house for the living. It was a tomb, sealed by the very blood Eleanor had tried to weaponize. The morning after the red moon did not bring the sun. Instead, a thick yellow fog rolled in from the Ocmulgee River, clinging to the manor like a damp shroud. The house was unnaturally silent. The hum had stopped, replaced by a heavy, vibrating stillness that felt like the moment before a structural collapse. Inside the library, the scene was a tableau of ruin. Eleanor Sterling was not dead, but she was no longer entirely human. She sat slumped in her velvet chair, her skin having taken on the translucent, gray quality of the hollow-eyed ones. Her violet eyes were wide, fixed on the ceiling, reflecting a world no one else could see. She was catatonic, her consciousness scattered across the thousands of names recorded in the Crimson Ledger. She had tried to hold too much history, and it had shattered her. Julian and Thomas were gone. Not dead in the physical sense, but hollowed. They wandered the halls of the manor like sleepwalkers, their eyes vacant. They no longer recognized each other, nor did they recognize the mother who had unmade them. Silas Jr., the youngest, had fled into the swamp during the night. The locals whispered that he had turned into something with fur and claws, a beast driven mad by the Sterling blood. The anomalies had retreated back into the cellar, but they had not gone back to sleep. The house began to manifest the physical symptoms of the family's moral decay. The walls sweated a dark, viscous fluid that smelled of old copper and wet earth. The grand staircase groaned under the weight of invisible footsteps. The Sterling dynasty wasn't just losing its grip on the land. The land was actively digesting the dynasty dot by midday. The news of the night of the red moon had reached the surrounding plantations. The neighbors' men who had turned a blind eye to Eleanor's experiments for years finally felt the shift in the air. They arrived at the gates with torches and hounds, but the dogs refused to cross the property line. They howled and clawed at the dirt, their instincts screaming that the Sterling estate was no longer part of the living world. "The blood is sour," the local sheriff remarked, staring up at the blackened windows of the manor. "There's nothing left in there but the debt." The collapse accelerated when the Crimson Ledger began to weep. The book, sitting on the desk where Eleanor had left it, began to emit a low, rhythmic thumping. With every thump, a new crack appeared in the foundation of the house. The ledger was trying to close the circle, but the weight of this selective lineage was too heavy. The geometric sigil on the floor began to glow with a dying, embers red light, pulling the very air out of the room. The enslaved people, led by Sarah, didn't wait for the white men to act. They knew the window of opportunity was small. They didn't burn the house. They knew fire wouldn't touch a place so saturated with the bloodroot. Instead, they performed a binding. They circled the house, planting salt and iron at every exit, sealing the Sterling rot inside its own cage. "Let the book finish what it started," Sarah said, her voice hard as flint. "They wanted to be part of the land. Now they're going to be the dirt under it." As the sun finally began to set, the manor gave a final, shuddering heave. The grand columns of the porch cracked. The roof groaned. Inside, the hollow-eyed children began to fade, their forms dissolving into the thick yellow fog. They were the ghosts of a future that would never happen. The aborted dream of a madwoman. The chapter ends with a haunting image. Eleanor Sterling, still sitting in her chair. As the floorboards beneath her begin to turn back into soft, wet mud, the house was reclaiming its materials. The Sterling name was being erased from the ledger of the living, one drop of blood at a time. The dynasty hadn't just ended. It was being unwritten. The reckoning of 1853 did not come from a courtroom or a gallows. It came from the collective soul of Lowndes County. As the Sterling Manor began its slow, agonizing descent into the mud, the surrounding community, both the free and the enslaved, realized that the bloodline was a contagion that could not be allowed to spread. The judgment began as a physical siege. The white plantation owners from neighboring estates, terrified that their own laborers would see the Sterling collapse as a signal for revolt, gathered at the perimeter. They brought iron chains and heavy padlocks, intending to bolt the doors of the manor from the outside. They wanted to bury the scandal, to pretend that Eleanor Sterling's Crimson Ledger was merely the delusion of a lonely widow. But the enslaved people knew better. They knew that a physical lock could not hold a spiritual rot. Under the cover of the Yellow River fog, Sarah and the elders of the Sterling quarters met the leaders from the neighboring plantations at the edge of the woods. In a rare, desperate moment of history, the racial hierarchy of the South buckled under the weight of a common supernatural threat. The white men had the guns, but the black women had the knowledge of the root. "You can't just lock the door," Sarah told the sheriff, her eyes reflecting the dying red glow of the manor. "The house is breathing. If you leave it standing, the fog will carry her voice into your own nurseries. You have to let the land take it back." The judgment took the form of a great silence. The community agreed to a pact. The Sterling name was to be struck from all local records. The property was to be declared blighted ground. No one would hunt there, no one would plant there, and no one would speak the names of Julian Thomas or Silas Jr. again. It was a social execution, a collective forgetting designed to starve the ledger of the attention it needed to function. But the land had its own judgment dot as the villagers watched from a safe distance. The hollow-eyed ones, the children who were neither fully human nor fully ghost, emerged from the cabins. They didn't run. They walked toward the big house in a single silent file. As they crossed the threshold, the manor seemed to exhale a cloud of black dust. The anomalies from the cellar rose to meet them, and for a moment the house was filled with a horrific, harmonic humming, the sound of the bloodline finally unifying. A sudden, localized earthquake shook the Sterling acreage. The ground, saturated with years of selective blood, turned into a liquefying vortex. The grand columns of the manor tilted inward. The library, with Eleanor still seated in her velvet chair and the ledger open on her lap, began to sink into the red Georgia clay. The sheriff and his men watched in terror as the earth literally swallowed the house. It wasn't a fire. It was a burial. The screams that echoed from within the walls didn't sound like human voices. They sounded like the grinding of stones and the snapping of ancient roots dot by dawn. The manor was gone. Where the great house had stood, there was only a steaming, muddy depression in the earth, quickly being overtaken by the aggressive, choking vines of kudzu. The judgment was complete. The Sterling family had been pulled into the very bloodroot. They had tried to master Sarah, stood at the edge of the pit, and threw the last of her iron charms into the mud. "Dust to dust," she whispered, "and blood to the deep." The chapter ends with the local registrar in the town square, opening a massive county record book. With a steady hand, he dips his pen in black ink and draws a thick, heavy line through the name Sterling. In the margins, he writes a single word in the official record, extinguished, but as the ink dries, a tiny, violet stain begins to bloom at the corner of the page, a sign that the judgment of Lowndes County was a delay, not a cure dot in the modern-day silence of the Lowndes County Library. The air felt like it had been sucked out of the room. Elias Thorne sat frozen, his hand gripping the pocket-knife, the blade hovering just inches above his palm. The secret language was no longer a mystery to him. It was a command. The symbols on the page were pulsing in time with his own quickening heartbeat, a rhythmic, violet throb that seemed to echo from the very mud beneath the floorboards. The manor had not truly been destroyed in 1853. It had merely been submerged. Elias realized with a sickening clarity that he wasn't standing in a house built on top of a ruin. He was standing in the upper branches of a carnivorous family tree. The sinkhole had been a stomach, and the Sterling line had spent a century digesting. "Record," the house whispered again. The sound didn't come from the walls. It came from the marrow of his bones. Elias looked down at the final blank pages of the crimson ledger. They weren't paper at all. They were a pale, translucent membrane, waiting for the final folding. He understood now why his mother had fled. Why his grandmother had died in a psychiatric ward, screaming about the purple eyes in the mirrors. They were the ones who got away, leaving the ledger hungry. He was the debt come due. With a mechanical, puppet-like motion, Elias pressed the blade into his skin. The pain was sharp, but it felt distant, as if it were happening to someone else. The blood that welled up wasn't the bright, healthy red of a living man. It was dark, viscous, and shot through with threads of bruised violet dot as the first drop hit the page. The ledger shivered. The ink didn't smear. It began to organize itself, crawling across the page to form the spidery, elegant script of Eleanor Sterling. But the words it wrote were his own thoughts, his own memories, being siphoned out of his brain and archived into the leather-bound tomb. January 3rd, 2026. The return is verified. The thorn Sterling branch has been grafted back to the root. The harvest of the 21st century begins tonight. The vessel is adequate. The blood is concentrated once more. Elias tried to pull his hand away, but the ledger was like a magnet, drawing the life out of him. He looked up and saw them, the hollow-eyed ones. They weren't ghosts. They were the shadows cast by his own biology. They stood in the corners of the library, their violet eyes glowing with a cold, welcoming light. They were his ancestors, his cousins, and soon they would be him. The manor began to breathe. The floorboards beneath Elias's chair turned soft, the wood transforming into a substance that felt like wet muscle. The library windows, once cracked and dusty, became clear and luminous, looking out not onto the Georgia woods, but onto the red-mooned landscape of 1853. Time was collapsing. The closed loop Eleanor had dreamt of was finally sealing shut. "I am the last," Elias wheezed, his vision fading as the ledger drank more of him. No, the voice of Eleanor resonated through his mind, sounding younger and more vibrant than ever. "You are the bridge. Behind you come the others. Every Sterling who ever walked the earth is waiting for this door to open." Elias's grip on the pen, or was it the knife, tightened. He made one final desperate entry, a jagged scrawl that broke through the elegant script. Stop. End the line. The ledger laughed. A drop of his blood hit the word end, and it dissolved, replaced by the word endure. As his consciousness slipped away, Elias felt the floor give way entirely. He wasn't falling. He was being pulled down into the cellar of shadows, into the dark, warm mud where the anomalies waited to greet their brother. The library above grew silent. The flashlight flickered one last time and died. The crimson ledger snapped shut with the sound of a closing coffin. It lay on the floor for a moment. Then slowly the floorboards rippled like water, and the book sank beneath the surface, returning to its lead-lined cavity to wait. Outside, the Georgia night was still. The kudzu vines on the Sterling estate grew another 3 inches, their tendrils curling around the rusted iron gates. In the nearby town, a young woman a distant cousin Elias had never met woke up in a cold sweat. She walked to the bathroom mirror and turned on the light. She gasped. For a fleeting second, before she blinked, her eyes weren't brown. They were the color of a bruised plum. The cycle was closed. The Sterling blood was won. And the ledger was waiting for its next scribe.